Yūichi Jin as a philosophical problem. In World Trigger, power is not defined by magnitude, destructive capacity, or raw physical dominance. Instead, power is framed as information, positioning, and the manipulation of outcomes. Within such a system, Yūichi Jin emerges not merely as a powerful character, but as a conceptual anomaly, a figure whose existence destabilizes traditional narrative assumptions about agency, responsibility, and heroism. Jin is not overpowered in the conventional sense. He does not overwhelm enemies through superior Tryon output, overwhelming firepower, or invincible combat ability. His power is subtler, more disturbing, and infinitely more isolating, the ability to see multiple possible futures. Foresight as existential isolation. Jin's side effect does not grant certainty. It grants possibility awareness. He sees branching timelines, some catastrophic, some survivable, some optimal, some merely acceptable. Crucially, this means Jin never experiences a singular reality in the way others do. Every decision is haunted by futures he prevented, futures he allowed, futures he sacrificed. This leads to a unique form of loneliness, temporal loneliness. No one else remembers the futures that never happened. No one else mourns outcomes that were erased before they could exist. Consider Jin's statement. As you well know, I have the side effect of foresight. I had seen multiple futures during the large-scale neighbor invasion, so when I found out they wanted to capture agents, I could have let Chica escape early on, but I didn't do that. This is not justification, it is confession. Jin openly acknowledges he foresaw danger, he recognized an alternative, he deliberately chose not to act on it. This immediately places him outside standard moral frameworks. Jin is not reacting under uncertainty, he is choosing between known consequences. The more the enemy focused on Chica, the less likely they were to damage the city. Here, Jin frames human lives as statistical buffers. This is not cruelty, it is strategic necessity, but it reveals the psychological cost of foresight. Jin must think in terms of probability distributions, not individuals. It worked out well in that respect, but you almost died, and Professor Replica's gone. This is the core tragedy of Jin's character. Even when he chooses the best available future, loss remains unavoidable. Foresight does not eliminate tragedy, it merely selects its shape. So it's my fault. It wasn't yours at all. This final admission encapsulates Jin's loneliness. He assumes responsibility not because others blame him, but because only he understands the causal chain. No one else can fully grasp what was traded away. Jin as the anti-protagonist strategist. Unlike Osamu, whose growth comes from learning strategy, or Kuga, whose growth comes from learning humanity, Jin's arc is defined by stasis under increasing burden. He does not develop in the traditional sense. Instead, the weight of his role accumulates invisibly. Jin is not trying to win. He is trying to minimize irreversible loss. This distinction places him closer to a wartime intelligence analyst or crisis forecaster than a soldier. His battlefield is not space, it is time itself. Who is Yūichi Jin? Jin Yūichi as a structural anomaly in the narrative. Within World Trigger, characters are typically defined by a clear narrative axis: growth, decline, adaptation, or revelation. Yūichi Jin resists this categorization. From his first appearance onward, Jin exists not as a participant in the story's developmental economy, but as a structural anomaly, a character whose primary function is not to change, but to stabilize the narrative universe itself. This distinction is crucial. Jin is introduced early as already competent, already knowledgeable, already positioned above the immediate concerns of rank, approval, or institutional authority. Unlike Osamu Mikumo, whose arc is predicated on learning how to survive in a system that initially overwhelms him, or Yumakuga, whose arc revolves around rediscovering humanity after a life of perpetual conflict, Jin arrives fully formed. His presence suggests that World Trigger is not interested in exploring how power is gained, but in examining what it means to live with power once it has already been acquired. Jin's narrative role, therefore, is not that of protagonist, antagonist, or mentor in the traditional sense. He is closer to a meta-narrative regulator, a figure whose actions ensure that the story does not collapse into either total catastrophe or total predictability. Casualness as camouflage. Jin's initial presentation is deliberately misleading. He appears unserious, playful, even irresponsible. He teases other agents, disregards formal hierarchy, and often behaves in ways that suggest impulsiveness rather than calculation. This performative casualness functions as a camouflage mechanism both diegetically and narratively. Diegetically, Jin's demeanor lowers the psychological guard of those around him. People speak more freely, argue more openly, and reveal more of their intentions when they believe they are not being judged by a hyper-rational observer. Narratively, this misdirection delays the audience's recognition of Jin's true function. He does not announce himself as a linchpin of the story. Instead, the reader gradually realizes that events tend to resolve favorably when Jin is involved, and disastrously when he is not. This delayed recognition is essential. If Jin were framed overtly as a godlike strategist from the outset, his foresight would feel contrived or narratively oppressive. By presenting him as a charming, slightly eccentric senior agent, the story allows his true significance to emerge organically. Despite his influence, Jin exists in a deliberately ambiguous relationship with Border as an institution. He is respected, feared, and occasionally resented, but never fully controlled. This semi-detached position reinforces his thematic role as someone who operates adjacent to authority rather than within it. Institutions rely on standardized procedures, shared information, and collective decision-making. Jin's side effect fundamentally undermines these principles. He possesses information that cannot be verified, cannot be replicated, cannot be fully explained without destabilizing morale. As a result, Jin cannot be fully integrated into Border's command structure without creating dependency or distrust. He must remain informal, consulted rather than obeyed, influential rather than authoritative. This keeps him perpetually at the margins of official power, even as he quietly shapes outcomes more than most commanders. This marginalization is not accidental. It reflects the story's understanding that foresight is incompatible with bureaucratic transparency. To institutionalize Jin's power would require either blind faith or coercive enforcement, both of which would undermine Border's internal cohesion. Meta role Jin as the embodiment of strategic vision. At a meta-textual level, Jin can be understood as the embodiment of World Trigger's core philosophy that intelligence, preparation, and long-term planning outweigh brute force. He represents the series' ideological commitment to strategy as the highest form of power. However, the story complicates this ideal by attaching a severe psychological cost to it. Jin's foresight is not framed as aspirational. Other characters do not seek to emulate him. Instead, they admire him from a distance, recognizing consciously or not that his role requires a level of emotional sacrifice they are unwilling or unable to make. This is a crucial divergence from traditional mentor figures. Jin does not invite discipleship. He does not pass on his methods. His power is incommunicable, and his decision-making process is fundamentally solitary. Temporal asymmetry and social alienation. One of the most profound consequences of Jin's side effect is temporal asymmetry, a state in which he occupies a fundamentally different temporal reality than those around him. While others react to events as they unfold, Jin has already lived through dozens of versions of those events in potential form. This asymmetry creates an unbridgeable communicative gap. Jin cannot fully explain his reasoning without revealing futures that will never occur. Even when he does explain, his explanations often sound arbitrary or manipulative because the causal chains he references are invisible to others. As a result, Jin is often misunderstood. His decisions may appear cold, reckless, or unfair, when in fact they are the product of intense ethical calculation. Yet because no one else can verify his foresight, Jin must operate without external validation. This isolation is not imposed by rejection, it is imposed by incommunicability, the burden of prevented futures. A unique psychological burden of foresight is the memory of futures that never happen. Jin alone carries the emotional residue of disasters that were avoided and lives that were never lost, but also of lives that could have been saved but were not. This creates a paradoxical form of survivor's guilt. Jin survives not only events, but entire timelines. He remembers tragedies that others will never know existed. At the same time, he remembers choices where he knowingly allowed harm to occur in order to prevent greater catastrophe. Thus, Jin's emotional landscape is populated by ghosts of possibility rather than memory. Foresight as a curse without catharsis. In many narratives, foresight is framed as a tragic gift, painful but ultimately redemptive. In Jin's case, there is no such catharsis. His foresight does not culminate in a singular heroic act that resolves his burden. Instead, it perpetuates an endless cycle of vigilance. Jin cannot retire from foresight, he cannot turn it off. Every future crisis will reactivate the same pattern of responsibility, sacrifice, and solitude. Thus, his side effect is not a curse in the dramatic sense, but in the existential sense, it condemns him to perpetual moral labor without closure. Why Yūichi Jin is the most overpowered character in World Trigger. Reframing power within the World Trigger paradigm. To understand why Yūichi Jin is the most overpowered character in World Trigger, one must first dismantle conventional definitions of power. In most action-oriented narratives, power is expressed through direct causal force, the ability to defeat opponents, overwhelm defenses, or impose one's will through physical or supernatural means. World Trigger explicitly rejects this hierarchy. The series instead constructs a layered model of power. Tactical power execution within combat. Operational power coordination and team-based optimization. Strategic power control over conditions before combat begins. Temporal power influence over which future becomes reality. Jin alone occupies the fourth tier. While elite combatants such as Kugayuma, Tachikawa Kei, or Shinoda Masafumi dominate within their respective tactical domains, their power is fundamentally reactive. They respond to threats that have already materialized. Jin's power operates earlier, at the level where threats are either allowed to exist or quietly eliminated before confrontation ever occurs. This is not superiority of strength, it is superiority of outcome selection. Tactical power visible, finite, replaceable. Tactical power in World Trigger is measurable. Trion levels, weapon loadouts, reaction speed, and battlefield awareness define who wins individual engagements. Even the strongest fighters remain constrained by spatial limitations, fatigue, surprise, numerical disadvantage. Most importantly, tactical power is replaceable. When one elite agent falls, another can eventually rise to fill the gap. The institution survives losses because tactical excellence is distributed. Jin's power is categorically different. There is no redundancy for Foresight. No backup unit can substitute for someone who sees futures. Temporal power and the illusion of fairness. One of the most unsettling aspects of Jin's strategic omnipotence is that it disrupts the notion of fairness. In a world governed by skill and preparation, success is theoretically earned. Jin's foresight undermines this by introducing asymmetric temporal information. When Jin intervenes, opponents are not defeated, they are outmaneuvered before they act. This creates a form of power that cannot be contested. No amount of training allows an enemy to counter a future they do not know exists. This is why Jin's presence feels oppressive in abstract terms, even though he rarely behaves oppressively in practice. His restraint is not imposed by limitation but by choice. Why Jin does not dominate the battlefield? A natural question arises: if Jin is so powerful, why does he not dominate every conflict directly? The answer lies in power concealment. Overt domination would collapse the delicate equilibrium Jin works to preserve. If his foresight became central rather than peripheral, border would become dependent on him, stop developing independent strategic capacity, risk catastrophic failure if Jin were ever absent. Thus, Jin deliberately limits his visibility. He allows others to struggle, fail, and grow, intervening only when futures threaten irreversible collapse. This restraint is itself a form of power, the ability to withhold intervention despite knowing the consequences. Strategic omnipotence as burden, not privilege. Omnipotence is often imagined as freedom. Jin's experience reveals the opposite. Strategic omnipotence binds him to responsibility. Because he knows which futures are possible, he cannot escape accountability for the one that occurs. Tactical fighters can lose and accept defeat as a consequence of being outmatched. Jin cannot. When a suboptimal future unfolds, he knows it is because he chose not to intervene or intervened incorrectly. Thus, his power does not elevate him above the system, it anchors him to it. Loneliness as a structural condition, not an emotional flaw. Jin is often framed as an emotional state, an absence of companionship, affection, or recognition. In the case of Yūichi Jin, loneliness is not a matter of temperament or social withdrawal. It is a structural condition produced by temporal asymmetry. Jin is not isolated because he refuses connection, nor because others reject him. He is isolated because he lives in a different experiential present. His perception of time fundamentally diverges from that of everyone around him, creating an unbridgeable gap that cannot be closed through empathy alone. This distinction is critical. Jin's loneliness is not curable through reassurance or understanding because it is not rooted in misunderstanding. It is rooted in incompatibility of experience, the solitude of unshared responsibility. Responsibility is typically distributed socially. Decisions are debated, votes are cast, blame is shared. Jin's foresight removes this social buffering. When Jin chooses a future, he does so alone. Even when others participate in decision-making, they do so without the same informational context. Jin cannot claim that responsibility was shared equally because he knows it was not. This results in a unique solitude, responsibility without consent. Jin does not ask to be responsible for outcomes at the scale he manages, yet he cannot relinquish that responsibility without allowing worse futures to occur. The quote, revisited confession without expectation of forgiveness. Jin's confession regarding the large-scale neighbor invasion exemplifies this loneliness. So, it's my fault, it wasn't yours at all. This statement is not an appeal for absolution. Jin does not expect forgiveness because forgiveness presupposes shared moral perspective. Instead, it is an act of moral bookkeeping, a recognition that causality and culpability reside with him alone. By assuming blame, Jin does not relieve others of guilt so much as acknowledge that they never possessed full agency in the first place. This is a devastating realization both for Jin and for those who hear it. Loneliness without alienation. Importantly, Jin is not alienated from others in the sociological sense. He is liked, respected, and trusted. People enjoy his company. This makes his loneliness more acute, not less. He participates in camaraderie he cannot fully inhabit. He laughs at jokes whose stakes feel trivial compared to the futures he has witnessed. He offers encouragement while carrying knowledge that renders encouragement provisional. This creates a form of existential loneliness, being surrounded by people while remaining fundamentally alone in one's perception of reality. Loneliness as the cost of guardianship. Jin's loneliness is not incidental, it is the price of his role. To be a guardian of futures is to stand apart from those who live within them. Shared fear, shared hope, shared relief, all are diminished when one knows how easily they could have been otherwise. Thus, Jin's solitude is not a tragedy imposed by fate, but a consequence of moral choice. He chooses to protect a world that can never fully understand the cost of that protection. Responsibility without consent. One of the most corrosive aspects of Jin's existence is that he never consented to the scope of responsibility imposed upon him. His side effect assigns him a role that exceeds normal moral boundaries. He becomes responsible not only for what happens, but for what could have happened and did not. This expands the domain of accountability beyond human scale. Crucially, this responsibility is non-transferable. Jin cannot delegate foresight. He cannot distribute knowledge of futures without destabilizing others. Thus, responsibility remains centralized within him alone. This is responsibility without consent, without delegation, and without relief. The replica incident as moral wound. Preview. Although examined in depth later, the loss of Professor Replica during the large-scale neighbor invasion represents a crystallization of Jin's moral injury. Jin foresaw outcomes in which Replica survived and outcomes in which he did not. He chose a future in which Replica was lost to preserve greater stability. This choice was not accidental, nor was it forced by ignorance. It was a deliberate ethical sacrifice. This is the essence of moral injury, acting correctly within a strategic framework while feeling internally that something sacred has been violated. Emotional regulation as survival strategy. Jin's calm demeanor is often mistaken for emotional detachment. In reality, it is a survival strategy. Emotional dysregulation would impair his ability to choose among futures. To function, Jin must suppress immediate emotional responses. This suppression, however, does not eliminate emotion, it delays it. The result is a slow accumulation of unresolved affect that manifests as quiet exhaustion rather than breakdown. Jin does not collapse under pressure because collapse would endanger others. His self-control is not resilience, it is necessity. Why the replica incident is central to Jin's character. Among all events in World Trigger, the loss of Professor Replica during the large-scale neighbor invasion occupies a singular position in the ethical architecture of the series. It is not merely a tragic moment, nor simply a plot catalyst. It is the clearest textual instance in which Yūichi Jin's foresight, strategic responsibility, and moral injury converge into a single, irreversible decision. This incident is not important because Replica dies. It is important because Jin knew. The Replica incident transforms Jin's foresight from an abstract narrative tool into a concrete ethical burden. It forces the audience to confront a question that World Trigger otherwise allows to remain implicit. What does it mean to knowingly allow the loss of an irreplaceable being in order to preserve a larger system, permitting loss as strategic redirection? Jin's decision to allow the enemy to focus on Chica functioned as a strategic redirection of violence. Rather than spreading destruction across the city, harm was concentrated. From a strategic standpoint, this is effective. From a moral standpoint, it is devastating. This is the moment where Jin crosses from protector to allocator of suffering. He does not cause Replica's death directly, but he allows a causal chain to proceed that he knows will end there. The moral weight lies not in action but in permission. Conclusion. The loneliness of the man who chooses the future. Yūichi Jin is not overpowered because he cannot be defeated. He is overpowered because he cannot escape responsibility. In World Trigger, power is not measured by how decisively one wins, but by how deeply one must live with the consequences of ensuring that others survive. Jin embodies this philosophy to its furthest, most unsettling extreme. Jin's loneliness is not born from alienation, arrogance, or emotional detachment. It is born from temporal asymmetry. He lives ahead of everyone else, carrying memories of futures that no one else will ever know existed. These memories shape his decisions, his restraint, and his quiet acceptance of blame. While others experience loss as tragedy, Jin experiences it as consequence often chosen, always remembered. His confession during the large-scale neighbor invasion reveals the true cost of foresight. Jin does not claim innocence, nor does he seek forgiveness. He recognizes that knowledge transforms morality. To know what will happen, and to allow it to happen anyway, is to accept fault even when no better alternative exists. This is not utilitarian coldness, it is tragic responsibility. What distinguishes Jin from other overpowered characters is not restraint alone, but endurance. He endures the knowledge that every victory contains a sacrifice, and that some sacrifices must remain unspoken. He endures the impossibility of being fully understood, even by those he protects. He endures without expectation of recognition, because recognition would require others to see what he sees, and that would only spread the burden further. In this way, World Trigger offers a rare and mature critique of power fantasy. It asks not what it would feel like to be the strongest, but what it would cost to be the most informed. Jin's foresight does not elevate him above humanity, it binds him more tightly to it, forcing him to make choices no one else is equipped to make. Ultimately, Yūichi Jin stands as one of the most quietly tragic figures in modern shonen storytelling. He is not the one who fights the hardest, nor the one who grows the most. He is the one who chooses again and again to shoulder the future so that others can live in the present. And that is why no one can truly understand him, because understanding Jin would require remembering the futures that never happened and living with the knowledge that they were lost so this one could exist. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe.